The major plot point that separates the first book of Samuel from the second is the death of King Saul, ultimately leading to King David's reign. There are 31 chapters in the first book of Samuel, and this morning we find ourselves in the 28th. David has already been anointed as the future leader and thus had God's favor. Saul, on the other hand, is spiraling. And in the final weeks of his reign, as is often the case with declining rulers, things got ugly. Saul, abandoned by God, is now desperate for advice so that he seeks out a witch, or perhaps a medium might be a more appropriate translation. She's been called many things over the centuries: a necromancer, a sorcerer, an oracle, but often a witch. The full story is 22 verses. However, Grant has ADHD, and he wouldn't ask us to listen for that long when he himself would struggle to pay attention, and he's really into this stuff. So instead, we'll just get to the story, started with verses 3 to 7, and Grant will take it from there. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. Saul had expelled the mediums and the wizards from the land. The Philistines assembled and came out encamped at Shunem. Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, not by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her." His servants said to him, "There is a medium at Endor." Here ends this morning's reading. Thanks be to God for these words of life.
So when Stephen Edwards and I sat down to talk about this service, we realized that music that specifically has to do with the witch of Endor really only comes from two sources. The first is choral music from the 17th and 18th centuries, namely Henry Purcell and Frederick Handel. And this would be pretty tough to pull off in the context of worship. It's not impossible, but we probably would have needed to have a conversation prior to this past Tuesday before having that kind of choral music. The other source is curveball heavy metal music. Now, there are almost countless subgenres of heavy metal. I'm sure all of you are super familiar with this. You've got technical metal, which we do have a sample of. Oh, this is the choral music. So that's forsaking Saul is what they're saying. And then do we also have the technical metal sample as well, hopefully? All of these songs, by the way, are named The Witch of Endor. So all you have to do is type in Witch of Endor into Spotify and you can find all of this stuff. There's also psychedelic doom metal with a Witch of Endor song, which sounds like this. So like slower, think sort of like maybe early Sabbath, sort of like, and then there's also sort of the more standard doom metal, which is my personal favorite, and that's this one. And this actually has lyrics that has to do with it. What's ironic is I talked to Stephen about that last one, and we could have actually played that last song in worship. The lyrics are just the story. That's what the lyrics are. Which, again, not impossible to do, but on short notice, I don't know where we would have found a metal band. Now, these may seem completely unrelated. However, Witch of Endor-themed music was not the only kind of music that was being composed in the 18th century. This, too, came out of that time period. This morning's prelude. And I'm being completely serious when I say this. Heavy metal music probably wouldn't be what it is today. In fact, it might not even exist if it wasn't for Bach's Toccata in D minor. That is by far the most metal piece of classical music in existence. Or maybe it's Baroque. Is it Baroque? Yeah, all right, not Baroque. It's the most metal piece of Baroque music ever produced. But either way, the first guitar piece sounds strikingly similar to that organ piece, which often comes as a surprise to folks not familiar with both the genres of classical music and Baroque and heavy metal, which I guess in an interesting twist of fate is much like this story. It is full of surprises, strangeness, and some confusion over where our faith ends and a celebration of the occult begins. So let's get into the story. Chris gave us some helpful background in terms of where we're at in the larger narrative arc of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Our story begins, now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him, and buried him in Ramah, his own city. Does that opening line remind anyone of another famous opening line from a story? Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Thanks to our familiarity with Dickens's Christmas Carol, we probably have some idea of what's coming in the way of apparitions. Then comes the second important detail. Saul had expelled the mediums and wizards from the land. And keep in mind, he was praised for this. God very much wanted him to do this. This made him a good ruler in the eyes of God. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 10 and 11 read, "No one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through fire, or who practices divination, or is a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or one who consults ghosts or spirits, or who seeks oracles from the dead." According to the book, Samuel did the right thing. Or Saul did the right thing. But now Saul is scared. He's sitting in his military camp, and he can see just how imposing the Philistine army is. And it's not like this is his first time in battle either. He's not scared to fight. He's scared because he's probably going to lose. Plus, God is no longer communicating with him. David is now God's favorite, and Saul is left to face a superior fighting force without divine assurance, which he's often had in the past through, you guessed it, Samuel, who he obviously can no longer seek advice from, or so we think. So backed into a corner, verse 7 reads, "Then Saul said to his servants," ooh, that was fun. "Then Saul said to his servants, 'Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her.' His servants said to him, 'There is a medium at Endor.'" Now, the story doesn't indicate what the timing looks like in this interaction, but the way it happens in my head is Saul is like, "Okay, listen, guys. I know I kicked all the witches and sorcerers out of the kingdom, but I'm going to need you to find me one, like ASAP." And without missing a beat, a guy from his entourage is like, "Oh yeah, there's a witch in Endor." I've heard she's pretty good. We should probably check her out. Like, the hypocrisy is next level. It's like a politician who is tough on crime and actively votes to intensify drug and prostitution laws, but then gets invited to a bachelor party and beforehand goes to his younger staff and is like, you guys probably know this. Where can I get some coke and dancers for this weekend? Like, really? Really, Saul? I've said it before and I'll say it again. Men are like the worst. And the reason I bring up the politician analogy is because the more this story continues, the more it feels like a politician buying drugs or sex in today's context. Verse 8, so Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes and went there, he and 2 men with him. They came to the woman by night, and he said, consult a spirit for me, and bring up for me the one whom I name to you. Saul isn't doing this dressed as his respectable public self, nor does he have the courage to do this solo. He brings 2 of his buddies with him, in case this whole thing goes sideways and he needs his buddies to back him up. And then Saul asks her to bring back a spirit from the afterlife. She, however, is no fool. Verse 9, the woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and wizards from the land. Why then are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? Now, I do want to talk about this woman for a bit before we go on. We can assume, for one, that she is unmarried, since in this culture we would probably be hearing about a husband in this story if she had one. And we don't know why. Perhaps she is widowed, perhaps she can't have children. Either way, she has been left to fend for herself. And in the ancient world, there were very, very, very few options available to women to support themselves. So the way I see it, she is operating illegally, the way folks do today in the street economy. And in order to make it in that kind of business, it helps to have some street smarts. She doesn't know who this guy is. I imagine she probably has regulars that come to her and ask her for her services, but a new client, I can't see her just being like, oh yeah, sure, no references, no big deal. Like, what can I do for you? She's smarter than that. Then in verse 10, Saul responds, but Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. And to me, this is outrageous. As the Lord lives, which is akin to us saying today, with God as my witness, you are swearing, you being Saul, are swearing by the very God that encouraged you to expel the mediums in the first place, that this particular medium in this particular moment will suffer no consequences for practicing her craft. Again, Saul's hypocrisy here is really unbelievable. Nonetheless, Saul's reassurance is apparently sufficient for her, and the story continues. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? He answered, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So we're left with several unanswered questions here. We know Saul asks for her to bring up Samuel. But what happens after that is somewhat up for debate. First, who has the power in this situation? Is this witch really able to summon spirits from the dead? That would seem, I don't know, like maybe a story we wouldn't want to put in the Bible. Like maybe we don't include the story about the witch's powers actually working. Many theologians have argued that it couldn't possibly be her power that accomplishes this task. It is that God has freely chosen to use her in this moment to summon Samuel. And those same theologians call to attention her crying out with a loud voice and argue it is because she wasn't actually expecting this to work. She expects to fake it like she usually does, but then is terrified because there is actually a real spirit now coming up out of the ground. And weirdly, it is in this moment that she also recognizes Saul for who he is. We aren't told why or how, But now she knows who has really asked for her services. So maybe she isn't afraid of the Spirit after all. Maybe she is afraid of the fact that she just performed witchcraft in front of the guy who outlawed it. Or maybe she knows who both of them are, Saul and Samuel, and is now standing between two of the most powerful men in Israel at that time, one alive and one very much dead or undead. That realization would also most likely be pretty overwhelming. Either way, she is very surprised. And the story continues. The king said to her, "Have no fear, what do you see?" The woman said to Saul, "I see a divine being coming up out of the ground." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" She said, "An old man is coming up. He is wrapped in a robe." So Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and did obeisance. At this point, I have to bring up that it does make some sense that Samuel would ask for Saul. Samuel was Saul's trusted prophet. However, before Samuel died, they didn't exactly part on good terms. Back in chapter 15, God is upset with Saul because God gave the command to kill every living thing amongst the Amalekites, men, women, children, livestock, everything. Now, I obviously don't have time to unpack that whole situation, so let's pretend for now that that divine command isn't absolutely horrifying. That's for another day. So God commands this slaughter, but Saul doesn't follow through. Instead, he kills everyone except Agag, the king, and the choicest livestock, because he wouldn't want them to go to waste. And that is a moral failure in the eyes of God. Now, I'm going to skip around and paraphrase a bit, but essentially God tells Samuel how angry God is. And then Saul shows up and is like, "I did the thing God asked, aren't I great?" And Samuel is like, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of cattle I hear?" Then Saul tries to explain his way out of it, tries to sort of rationalize or justify his actions. And Samuel doesn't buy it, and he goes to leave, but Saul grabs a hold of Samuel's robe and he tears it. And Samuel's now really angry and says, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this very day and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." Ouch. Saul then continues to plead with Samuel. So to make a point, Samuel summons the spared king, Agag, and literally hacks him to pieces in front of Saul, and then they part ways and never speak again. The chapter ends with the line, and I'm not making this up, "And the Lord was sorry that he had made Saul king over Israel." Again, ouch. So although I can kind of see why Saul is summoning Samuel, that was also fun to say, I can kind of see why Saul is summoning Samuel. Samuel has been his go-to guy for divine guidance before for battles, but I'm also like, what are you doing, Saul? You think Samuel's going to be happy to see you? Do you think he's going to be willing to help you? I kind of doubt it. And the first thing out of Samuel's mouth after he's summoned, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" I love that. Samuel is like kind of grouchy as a character in the Bible, and then he's also grouchy as an undead character. Samuel is now full-on present as a ghost in front of this medium and Saul and is like, "Quit bugging me. I'm not even supposed to be here. What do you want?" And Saul falls right back into the old pattern and pleads with Samuel. "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have summoned you to tell me what I should do." Really, Saul? Like, read the room, dude. You think God has just been like really busy and hasn't gotten to your prayers yet? You think that's a coincidence? And I'm sure all of you can probably guess what Samuel's response is. To paraphrase, "Why are you even asking me this question? I already told you the kingdom belongs to someone else now, aka David, because you screwed up. Moreover, you are going to lose the battle tomorrow. Many people, including you and all of your sons, will die, and those remaining will be captured." I'll finish out the end of the story here, verses 20 through 26. "Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear, because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. The woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, 'Your servant has listened to you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now, therefore, you listen to your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you. Eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way.' He refused and said, 'I will not eat.' But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he got up from the ground and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fatted calf in the house. She quickly slaughtered it, and she took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened cakes. She put them before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night." Saul collapses in fear and exhaustion. This supposedly evil sorceress sees his suffering, knows this is his last night alive, and not only offers, but insists on exercising hospitality. She does what any model Jew or Christian should hypothetically do in this situation. She sees the suffering of another human being and assuages it. She prepares essentially a small-scale royal banquet for Saul's final meal. The man who single-handedly made her life a living hell by outlawing her only source of income. The man that forced her to live in fear of the death penalty. She hosted an extravagant meal for him. When Mike and I discussed this passage this past week, we found ourselves asking the question, again, how did this story even make it into the Bible? The witch of Endor, the necromancer, comes out looking like a model human being. She demonstrates welcome, courage, intelligence, and mercy. Or maybe that is the point. Maybe the very point is to challenge us in how we look at people. Maybe the point is to show us that some of the ways in which we deem others less than are based more in our own shortcomings, not theirs. Maybe this story is meant to remind us that it is not reputation or even really words, but actions that truly show what kind of person someone is. A little story from my own life, and then our brother Stephen Ewell will lead us in song. One of the requirements of seminary, certainly at CTS, but I think it's pretty much everywhere now, is field education, completing 400 hours of work in the field. This could be at a local church. That's how we got Victoria a few years back. Or it could be with a nonprofit. I did mine with the youth outreach team at the night ministry. Fall, winter, and spring, I stood outside every Tuesday and Thursday night with other interns and staff as we handed out food and supplies, but more importantly, offered a sense of community and care. I learned a lot on that street corner. I learned just how white I am. Turns out I'm real white and real suburban and real privileged. But I also learned a lot about other people and how sometimes things are not how they appear on the surface. For example, many street-based young people I worked with wore better clothes than I did. Why? Because I don't have to be dressed well enough to get into a 4 a.m. club just for safety and warmth in the middle of winter, and then ride the L until places open again in the morning. We did our best to maintain a safe environment in that parking lot, but it is a parking lot. You can't control everything. And when you have a gathering of primarily people in their late teens and 20s, you're going to get arguments and you're going to get scuffles every now and then. I can't remember which month it was, but we had several pretty intense altercations in a very short period of time. And not only are we not in favor of physical violence just as a moral stance, but if the cops get called over and over again, then the city won't let us do it anymore. And then we've got a real big problem. As staff and interns, we went round and round trying to think up ways to address this uptick in fighting. And then my supervisor started talking to, we'll call him Jay. Jay was older for our crowd, late 30s maybe. He had been a regular when he was a teen and made it, so to speak. Just by talking to him, you could tell that he was a smart guy. Didn't spend much time in school, but highly intelligent. He had a well-paying job, stable housing, a car, real nice watch. But he came back and hung out with the people on the corner because those were his people. And he loved what the night ministry does. It was important to him. Another small detail about Jay, he was a former mid-level gang member, somewhat high-ranking. I said he was smart, and it was clear whatever organization he was working for, he was going to get promoted quickly, and he did. Unfortunately, his first job was working for a gang. Now, by the time I met him, he had been out of the game a long time. Out of the game, but not without contacts and influence. My supervisor told Jay about the uptick in fighting, how it might be related to some family disputes. Street-based folks are often disconnected from their families of origin, and so they form their own. It functions somewhat like a gang in that it provides a sense of community and offers protection. The primary difference between a family and a gang, however, is that a gang exists primarily for profit. There is no profit component to the family. So they don't fight over territory. But if there is animosity between two people from two different families for whatever reason, it can escalate into animosity between two groups of people, or in the worst case scenario, one person and a group of people. Jay listens to my supervisor describing our predicament and then quietly and calmly said, "Well, we can't have that. This ministry you guys do is too important to get shut down for fighting. I'll take care of it." Do I know what "I'll take care of it" meant? I do not. I'm not sure I want to know exactly. But what I do know is that he wasn't lying when he said he still had sway, because it was as if Jay snapped his fingers and the fighting stopped. We didn't have another fight for the rest of my internship. The cops never got called again. People felt safer. I remember my supervisor saying to me, "Street ministry makes for interesting bedfellows." And that challenged me to think about what assumptions I had made about the kind of person Jay was, simply because of what he did, most likely as his only means of survival when he was a younger man. Who in our lives today are witches? Sex workers, gang members, drug dealers? Who do we push to the side? Who do we view only as a means to an end? Greg Boyle, founder of Homeboy Industries, reminds us there should be no daylight that separates us, only kinship. Inching ourselves closer to creating a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. Soon we imagine with God this circle of compassion. Then we imagine no one standing outside of that circle, moving ourselves closer to the margins so that the margins themselves will be erased. We stand there with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. Amen.